Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
I've been thinking a lot about joyfulness recently, and I was imagining myself as a young child and remembering how I thought about joyfulness and happiness, and how I used to think as a kid, like most kids do, joyfulness happens to me from the external world. My situation somehow creates this idea that I'm going to be joyful and happy by my circumstances, set up right, or by happenstance, quite frankly. And I think most of us have this viewpoint as children that happiness and joyfulness is something out there that happens to us. And then we mature and we become adults, or on our way to becoming adults, and we have this transition where we go, wow, I really can't control the outer world. I can't control the environment. I can't control what happens out here. And if I have to wait for circumstances outside of myself to create joyfulness in my life, I'm going to be waiting a long time. And in fact, I might be very disappointed when it never comes. And so we change and we come inward and say, this has to come from within. This is something that's an inner game situation. I create joyfulness for myself. I respond to things that happen in my external world. I set up the circumstances for myself to be joyful no matter what happens out there. And I think this is where a lot of people stop and plateau. They realize it's an inner game. They realize it's something that has to come from within. And it's kind of like still a little bit of magic thinking around it, though. It's still a little bit of like, well, maybe this will happen, or hopefully this will happen, or if I set up things just maybe this way, it'll happen, and not real clear on how that works. And I think I'm shifting my viewpoint now into seeing joyfulness and happiness and the good things that happen as actually a skill that I build, something that I strive and work hard to create in my life. So it is an inner game, but it also takes skill building. It takes effort, and I have to learn something new. It's something I learn and build skill around to create joyfulness in my life. So today we want to talk a little bit about this, unpack this idea of joyfulness is a skill you build in your life. Maybe it's full of hard work even. And what does that mean for you in your life? And how could you build the skill and work hard to create more joyfulness for yourself?
That idea that kids think that joyfulness or happiness comes from without, I suspect that's an instinctive understanding that joy is an emergent of a system. Like I think that even though most people are not systems thinkers, most of us have been raised to think in terms of cause and effect. I think we still have an internal inner wisdom knowing that nothing is that simple, that things are more complicated than that. And I think that the idea of growing up a little bit and realizing that it's not external things that are happening to you, but it's something that also must be addressed from within, I think that that's still an attempt to understand how the system works. Like what creates joy as an emergent? You're talking about skill development, which I don't think a lot of people would consider as a component of joy. Like I have to build skill around joyfulness. What does that even mean? But I think we have an intuitive knowing that joy or happiness, assuming they're the same thing, let's just, for the sake of the argument, conflate them as the same. There might be a distinction between the two, but I don't think that's the point of the conversation. That it's an emergent property of an entire system running, and external components are some of the nodes in the system, and internal components are some of the nodes in the system. And some of the nodes we don't even consider as things, as being part of the system, like skill development. What does that mean? What does it mean to develop skill and joy? And we know that external factors can disrupt our joy, right? Something really kind of terrible happens or something amazing happens, and that definitely impacts our mood. Our mood goes up and down. So we know that their external things can impact us and can either disrupt or amplify our feelings. So we know external stuff is a part of it. And then, as you mentioned, we mature and realize, well, it's got to also come from within because we can't always control those external things. So let's try to find joy from within. But I don't think that's a full picture either. I think joy is the emergent of a system that understands the tension point between those two worlds, how the external world impacts us, what we are responsible for in the inner world. And the skill development is how do we let the positive things in the outside world amplify our feelings while not letting the negative things in the outside world, pull the rug out from under us or undercut them or have very, very temporary sort of comet tails, right? Like if it's going to impact us, it's not going to be for a super long time or completely derail us. And how do we build a sustainable system where both the inner work and the outer work are together helping us create joy as an emergent property as often as possible? And I think that that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Like it feels more empowering to me anyway. It feels empowering to think of it as something that's manageable, and I just need to break down the components. I just need to sort of understand it as this system that it is. Because if it is an emergent of a system and we don't think of it that way, we think of it as a cause effect. This thing happened, so I am happy. This thing happened, so I'm not happy. It feels very fickle. It feels like we don't really have that much control over it, even if it's an internal thing. Because I think, I've gotten into meditation at different time periods in my life. And sometimes those time periods have been very conducive to a Zen-like quality that felt like peace. And that helped me access happiness and joy more often. But then in other times, meditation didn't really do much for me at all. It was just hard, and it wasn't very conducive to that sense at all. So then what's missing? What's the thing that I'm missing? Like, how am I doing it wrong? Should I be doing some other kind of meditation? So I think thinking about it entirely internal isn't a complete picture. And then it becomes confusing when, if I take full responsibility and I make it entirely an inside job and that's not panning out, then I think that it can get demoralizing that way too. So I think seeing it as a full system and understanding it's a relationship between all of these things, and that there are ways to develop insights and skill and turning the unconscious conscious, I think that feels way more empowering. And I think it helps us actually get to our end game more often. We actually can have the emergent that we're seeking, and it helps us feel a greater sense of control over the entire process.
I also think when we talk about the realm of emotions, how we feel, how we experience life, we often are talking about the difference between reaction and response. And again, there's like a maturity level here. The younger you are, the less mature you are, the more you're reacting to things in your world. You're reacting to your inner state, your inner emotions. You're reacting to the external stimuli and the emotions you're feeling from others. You're reactive. As you mature, you realize, well, I don't need to be reactive. I need to be more responsive. When something happens, I take a breath, I check in with myself, I check in with the situation, and I don't have to react from instinct. I can respond from thoughtfulness. And there's this big reframe that often happens as we mature as people from a reactive frame to a responsive frame. And I think that's a really good thing. I think as we make that transition, that's a good transition to make. And I would say that's not the complete picture. I'm realizing in my life that as I mature, I'm very responsive to things that come into my world, my inner state, my outer world around me. I'm getting better at being responsive to things and dealing with them in much more mature ways. And I think there's a skill stretch that I can do here from the responsive side to a proactive way of dealing with the world. So now I'm on the offense emotionally and in my inner state and the way I show up to the world. I'm no longer even responsive. I still am. I mean, obviously I can't be proactive constantly, but I'm learning that if I can train myself toward the skill of joyfulness and happiness, train myself to have this push of how I want to feel proactively in the world, how I want to experience life, I can be proactive and bring that with me, almost preset how I'm going to feel about things before they even happen. That increases the ability for me to be even more responsive in a really positive way for myself, because I've already decided how I'm going to respond to something. I'm sure you've had this experience where you knew you were going to a party or some event and you were dreading it. You were hating the idea of having to go there. You had made up your mind that you were going to be miserable when you got there or on your way there, and even after you left, before you even had the experience happen. You'd already pre-designed in your mind how that event was going to go down experientially for you. And maybe you've had an experience where it's just the opposite. You had decided you were going to have an amazing time at this event coming up, and you just decided it. And so when you entered that, it didn't matter what happened. The place you were in could have burned down. the smoke alarms could have gone off and water could have come down on you and gotten everybody wet and you had to evacuate and people were crying and upset that it was ruined and you had already decided you were going to have an amazing time no matter what. And I think this is what I'm talking about, this idea of proactively showing up to the world, building the skill we need as humans to enter every environment, pre-deciding how we're going to feel. And with that choice in front of us, I believe it's healthy to choose to feel joyful and happy no matter what those experiences and circumstances are.
So in the system of creating happiness or letting happiness be the emergent of a system, what you're talking about is the skill that is developed internally within oneself to first get away from emotional reactivity. Reactivity means when the outside world presents something to us, we believe the emotion that we're feeling as a like whatever got triggered. Basically, that's reacting is basically the same thing as being triggered. The outside world did something, it triggered an emotion in us. We believed the emotion effectively, right? We thought that was the appropriate response because it is the response we had. And then we simply show that emotion, right? We react to the situation with the emotion that it triggered inside of us. So the next level of skill development then is to go to responsiveness, which is, like you just mentioned, the emotion that was triggered inside of me. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to wait for a moment to determine whether or not that's the appropriate emotion for the situation. Will it help me get to my desired end game, whatever that is? Kind of like the idea of like developing patience. It's almost like a patience with yourself and a patience with the outside world. Somebody said something, it pissed me off. Do I want to show up with the energy or the feeling of being pissed off? Is that something that's going to be conducive to my end game? Right now, our end game that we're talking about is happiness. Is getting pissed off something that I want to do? Well, I mean, if you're going through a time period of, developing through, some sort of traumatic experience where your therapist is like, you need to get pissed off more often and you need to let yourself feel permission to be pissed off, and being pissed off is the thing that you'll do in order to feel empowered and to let off some steam, then the answer might be yes. You give yourself permission to be pissed off and show that you're angry. And if you're not going through something like that, you can wait a beat and go, if I show up pissed off or angry, am I just going to escalate a bad situation? Probably. It's probably not going to do anybody any good. This is not going to create win-wins. This is not part of my long game of emotional development. So I'm going to hang tight, show some patience, ask myself what a better response would be, and maybe it's simply curiosity. Why did you say what you said? Right? Curiosity is maybe the better emotion to experience here. It'll de-escalate everything and it will allow me to see a bigger picture. And so what you're saying then is the next level of skill development after responsiveness being I don't just react, but I respond to the situation by giving myself a moment to calibrate what I want to be showing up as. You're saying that you're even proactively determining the kinds of emotions that you want to experience in the world, meaning that you show up with curiosity because that's the emotion you want to be showing at all times. So when somebody says something, you don't even feel the trigger of anger anymore because you already decided you're going to show up with curiosity. And so that's like the elevated level. I think that's really hard to do. That's super hard to do. I suspect the reason why you're so good at that is because you're an ENFP.
I don't even know if I'm good at it. That's what I'm striving toward. I'm seeing that as the vision. I mean, I get triggered. I have a reaction and I have to respond to things. It's not like I go through the world never feeling down. Like I can't just be in a joyful state all the time, even though that's the ideal that I think I'm striving for.
But that's the skill development that you're in right now. And I think that's that makes me think of Tony Robbins' empowering rules versus disempowering rules, which is that anytime you have a rule about something, how something has to happen in order for it to be okay, you've automatically created a disempowering rule. But if you are able to be adaptable to a situation and take it as it is, then you're going to have a lot more empowerment in your life. You're going to be able to flow through the things that happen to you in a way where you haven't set up all this series of requirements or expectations for the outside world in order for it to be okay for you. You're kind of showing up and being okay with whatever you have to navigate through. He said the number one most empowering rule is that you're always going to have fun. No matter what happens, you've decided you're going to have fun. And that makes me think of what you're talking about, which is a proactive stance that when you enter a situation, you have preceded your emotions to experience fun. And I think that's interesting. I think as feelers, because I suspect Tony Robbins is a feeler, as feelers, I think you might have a bit of an easier time of navigating through this. I think as a thinker, this feels a little bit more like magic to me. This idea that I'm going to precede a situation knowing the emotion I'm going to feel. I think the closest that I would be able to get to that is to strip the emotion out. Like if I don't want to be triggered, if I don't want to be reactive, if I want to be responsive, I kind of take one step back from my emotions, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. I think having a little bit of distance, if emotions aren't your sandbox, if that's not the place that you're really good at like sort of going in and out of, I think there's nothing wrong with taking 1 degree of separation from them in order to not be sort of this emotional mess.
I think we expand the idea of what emotions are, though. You use the word, the emotion, or use the phrase, the emotion of curiosity. You see curiosity as an emotion in some ways, right?
Yeah.
That's what you said earlier.
Yeah, that's true. I did.
Meaning emotions, I think, especially to you thinkers, I don't know, you guys seem like they're like these weird magical things that kind of happen to you. And like you're saying, that distance between it, but maybe the expansion of the definition of what you experience as an emotion could be good here as well.
Yeah, I would say that maybe it's not so much that emotions are things that happen to us, although that is true too. It feels more like emotions are the things that happen to everybody around us, and then we have to deal with them.
Fair enough.
And I think taking a step back, I mean, curiosity, I think expanding the definition to include curiosity, that might be actually more of an emotionally neutral place, and then calling upon your mental faculties to come in and sort of help you sort it all out. So the emotion of curiosity might not be technically true, but it's more like if I'm mad, what is a good antidote to anger? It's understanding. And oftentimes anger is the most powerful disempowering emotion, right? It's the disempowering emotion that makes you feel like you have power and control in the world. And I think I read someplace that it's invariably a mask for pain and hurt. Like your feelings are hurt, but you don't really want to be in a vulnerable space, like to whatever hurt your feelings. So you're going to put on anger in order to let the thing that hurt your feelings know that you're no pushover, even though underneath it all was just pain anyway. So I think the best antidote to anger is curiosity, because why did you get your feelings hurt? Did the person intend to hurt your feelings? Usually the answer is no. If you go in with the space of curiosity, then oftentimes it sort of deconstructs what was going on, and then your understanding allows you to be compassionate to the person who triggered you, and now you're not in that space anyway. You've just basically neutralized the entire situation. So I think that preceding this, or building the skill of determining the emotion that you're going to enter a space with. As a feeler, I could see that being a space of like high vibration energy, something that you're going to enter with joyfulness. And I think as a thinker, maybe I could get to that space, but it's like kind of like the emotion of joy is sort of like the system has to be running really well for me to be feeling joy most of the time. Joy is a little elusive. And so for me, what I do is I try to get into a space of like sort of emotional neutrality. And that's one of the better spaces I can get, because fundamentally, if I can understand a situation and I'm able to play with it in the space like that a thinker would play with it in like information and understanding and problem solving, that's going to be more conducive to me feeling joy anyway, because that's going to be more in my sandbox.
So I'm going to push you a little hard here.
Okay.
A little harder. And say, okay, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. You're like, you're as a feeler, Joel, you're talking about getting an emotional space of feeling something proactively. And we could also talk about states, like states of being and ways of like showing up to the world in a state. And in some ways you could see that as a place where joyfulness could emerge from. So as an example, the state of being in a proactive place, like being in a proactive state, one could even find this as maybe a very empowering place to be.
Oh, definitely. Anything proactive is empowering.
Exactly. And it's proactive in all areas. You talked about, this idea of, well, when we don't have an end game, sometimes we're reactive. And as we get more of an end game, we're more responsive, I think you talked about. And I would say the more clear we get on where we're heading, the end game, quote unquote, maybe purpose and mission even, where, even if it's a small one right now, it helps us keep our emotions centered and more positive when we have a place we're heading. So getting into a state of proactivity is really a state of, I know where I'm going. I'm steering the ship of my life somewhere, even if it's just through this conversation I'm having right now, or this event I'm attending, or even on a bigger scale of what I want my life to look like down in 10 years from now. I'm in a proactive state of steering my life, and now I'm deciding how I want to show up to my life because I'm on a trajectory towards something.
I think that what I may have been unconsciously but possibly intentionally saying is that that to a feeler, predetermining the emotion you want to go in with probably is a bigger node in the system. Like if joy and happiness is the emergent of a system running with a bunch of different nodes, and let's pretend all of those nodes are the same for every person. Let's just pretend that. I think what creates distinctions in personalities and types and even individuals is that some of those nodes will be bigger than other nodes. So as a feeler, predetermining the emotion you want to experience as the magnet in the middle of the field or your end game may be a bigger node in that system than it would to somebody who's a thinker. There might be other nodes in the system that are bigger and more important.
I could see that. I'm going to give a little pushback again, more devil's advocate than saying you're wrong about anything.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, in my mind, would be like saying, well, thinkers would have a better time of determining how they're going to think about something because they have more thoughts available. And actually, I guess that could be said about thinkers, and you could say this about feelers, but in a way, thinkers are more likely to find new thoughts or thoughts they hadn't predetermined because they have so many thoughts available. It's actually feelers that would probably already have predetermined thoughts ahead of them that they're going to think about, and they haven't vetted those again because they're not going through all the different thoughts that could come to them. So the same thing with thinkers going, like there's probably more predetermined emotions thinkers are willing or not willing to feel because they don't live in the world of emotions. So they probably do determine what they're going to feel more than feelers do.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think what I would add is that to feelers, it seems like your nuance and variety in emotions trump ours. Like you have more distinctions to be made in how you're feeling than thinkers. That's why things like the emotion wheel are such aha moments for thinkers. There are emotions in there in the emotion wheel that I look at that I'm like, I don't think I've ever felt that before. I'm sure I have, but I would not be able to identify the moment that I was. So I think that there are more distinctions in emotions that feelers have. And so you're less likely to predetermine the emotion you want because you want to be open to the experience of whatever authentically is coming up for you. Like you're going to want a little bit of wiggle room in there to be able to feel a kaleidoscope of emotions. And that's, I think, what you're saying about thinkers as well. That a thinker is not going to come in with a predetermination of how they think about a situation because they're going to want to be able to juggle all the new thoughts that come at them and to be able to sort of figure things out and problem solve as they go and understand it. But I would say that as a thinker, I'm far more likely to come into a situation knowing my set principles, like the things I already know to be true. Also my frameworks, like what are the frameworks that I come into a situation with so that as I'm manipulating the new information and data that flies at me, I have a place to organize it or a way to organize it. I'm far more likely to enter a situation with all those mental models and maps because I've been collecting them for so long. And these are like foundational core principles that I carry with me no matter what. And I think when you talk about predetermining an emotional set or like a state when you go into it, I don't think you're saying that this is the specific emotion I want to feel. And so therefore, no matter what comes at me, I'm going to default feel this emotion. Because then you wouldn't be able to to go through that, what I imagine is a joyful exercise of exploring all of your emotional terrain. And if that's a joyful experience, I mean, I think one of the things we didn't do is define what joyful means.
I see it as a platform more than an emotion. It's
a
platform to feel emotion from.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, so you're going to have to...
It's a state. It's like a state you're in.
Okay, we'll have to deconstruct that in a second because I'm not 100% sure what that means. But if feeling if the ability to feel the full kaleidoscope of emotions, including the ones that I would, in a very blunt instrument way, call bad ones, but as a feeler, you want to be able to experience and express all of those, that would be conducive to you feeling joy. And that means that joy can come from things that one could argue would also cause pain, which I don't think most people would see any sort of relationship to. If you're feeling pain, how on earth can you feel joy? But joy, I mean, I guess maybe you say that it's a platform to feel other things, but to me, I guess joy is the most related to a sense of intrinsic reward. Like whatever it is I'm doing is making me feel like an sense of intrinsicness. Like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It's a feeling of whoever I am and whatever I'm doing and whatever moment in on the planet or moment in history and place on the planet that is supposed to be right is all converging together. This is all what is supposed to be happening, right? Like, and that's just the only way I can describe that is a sense of intrinsicness. And sometimes that has nothing to do with fun or happiness.
That's right.
Yeah, it's just like this is right. I guess it's a sense of rightness.
Yeah, I think it's a sense of something. It's like a sense of something beyond the emotions that are experienced. Like you could be in the middle of your grandmother's funeral and everyone's weeping and crying. There's grief there. But the reason there's grief is there's a joyful life that probably passed away. Like there was something good that was honored and respected and positive. Mm-hmm. There's joyfulness in that moment even to celebrate the life that my grandmother represented.
Yeah, like sacredness and preciousness, like meaning, something core, something deeper than
aliveness.
Whatever. Yeah, aliveness, exactly. So happiness, though, I think is a very loaded term. Happiness makes me think of like bright beaming faces with huge smiles and like abundance around and, you know, like everybody's having a good time. That's happiness. I think we're talking about something a little different than happiness. So early on in the conversation, I conflated joy and happiness together, but I actually think that this is the moment when the distinction should be made. When you're talking about joyfulness, you're actually talking about like you're talking about a sense of rightness and meaning and intrinsicness. And almost like an inner peace, almost like this is like it's all going to be okay. And no matter what happens, it's all going to be okay. And so I think coming in with that sense into a situation doesn't preclude feeling all of that emotional experience. And I think as a thinker, the corollary would be going into a situation with those sort of core foundational frameworks means that no matter what gets thrown at me, I'm going to be able to understand it. It's like this belief that I'm going to be able to understand anything that gets thrown at me because I have enough sense of self and mental models to organize the information and to fully understand it. So coming in with those models doesn't preclude me being able to take in new information and fill out those models and fill out those sort of deeper understandings. So I may have completely derailed us, by the way, by creating a feeler versus thinker distinction.
Uh-oh.
But going back to the framework that I'm using in this conversation, it probably doesn't sound like we're using a framework at all, but really what I started out with was this idea that there's a system running that creates joy as we're defining it, which is effectively meaning and inner peace. There's a system running that allows for that to be the emergent. And the inner work is for you going in with the sense that you're going to make sure that that is the feeling you feel at the end of all of it. No matter what other feelings come in, you're going to make sure that you center yourself or rest into that sense of intrinsicness. Is that effectively what I'm hearing?
I think an illustration might be good to get a sense of what I'm attempting to communicate. So you probably have seen the show SpongeBob SquarePants. There's this great episode, and I think SpongeBob is an example of kind of what I'm talking about. There's this episode where he and Patrick, his best friend, think they're going to go to summer camp, and they're lining up for the bus to go to summer camp. And instead of getting on the bus to summer camp, somehow something happens accidentally, and they get in a bus and get sent to this prison to be tortured in this like island prison or something. But they still think they're going to summer camp. Like in the entire episode, they think they've ended up in summer camp. And so the prison guards are running them through things that are just horrible torture. You got to dig a big pit, a big hole. And they're like, this is so much fun. And they're digging it and they're singing. And he's like, why are you singing? This should be torture. So he puts them through more torturous things. He locks them up. And they radically interpret every experience they're having on this prison island as fun and joyfulness. Like they've already determined they were going to be in a state of joyfulness before they went to summer camp. They were excited about summer camp. And the narrative is, hey, we're going to have fun. We're at this experience we got to have now, and we're going to have fun doing it. And literally anything that the prison guards throw at them, they chemically alchemize in their minds or their hearts into something that's joyful for them. And it's funny in an episode of SpongeBob, right? But he's kind of like this as a character. He and Patrick they interpret things positively no matter what happens to them in their world.
It's like the Tao of SpongeBob.
Right? And so this is kind of, that's an extreme example. It would take a lot of concerted effort to be sent to a prison island and be tortured and find joyfulness in that. But most of us, that's not our experience. Most of us, it's just something mundane. Somebody said something we didn't like, or we have to go to that event that we're scared about or nervous or we don't like the people at or whatever it is in life. And we get in these pre-designed states for ourselves when I believe we can build the skill of entering the world proactively, choosing to feel joyfulness literally in the middle of horrible things.
Was SpongeBob, were they actually being tortured or were they just set to do grueling labor?
I think they were like stretched out in the sun and tortured like in hot sun or something. I think there were actual torturous elements to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that's actually a perfect illustration. I think that that's a perfect illustration that helps me know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that is a difficult place to get into when you are someone who feels like you have to be deconstructing everything you're experiencing and understanding it. Like as a thinker, to be able to hand yourself over to simply experiencing. Because actually what you're talking about is preceding a state of like the assumption, the expectation is you were going to have fun. And you just never questioned that. Or SpongeBob didn't, right? And Patrick. They just never questioned it. So everything they experienced, they were fully present in the moment and filtered it through that interpretation. So it's almost like a form of self-brainwashing, right, in that situation. And by the way, I think self-brainwashing is a fantastic technique. I think it's a wonderful tool that we massively undervalue because we think brainwashing is bad. But the truth is we're all brainwashed. How are we brainwashed is the important question, not if we are brainwashed. And self-brainwashing is a fantastic technique. I think it's actually really smart. The challenge is you have to be really good at being present. And you have to have constructed some really good, I would call them mental models, you would call them states, to ensure that you're not talking yourself out of feeling that way. So on some level, as a person who shows up wanting to understand everything and not just experience it, in some ways, it's almost harder to get yourself to proactively determine a state or proactively determine how you're going to feel in a situation, because there's a lot of pieces I'm talking for myself or speaking for myself. There's a lot of parts of me that want to deconstruct as I go, as opposed to just setting up a lens. Like I'm constantly questioning my own lenses. I put a lens through which I filter the world, but as I'm filtering the world through that lens, I'm spending more time questioning the lens than I am the things that are coming in. Does that make sense? And that's the tendency to want to be aware of one's own biases. But you're talking about a node in the system of building the skill of fully acknowledging this bias and doubling down on it. And I think that that's smart, actually. Like, if we're going to have biases, it just is. It's like, it's not if you're brainwashed, it's how you're brainwashed. It's not if you have biases, it's what your biases are. And consciously choosing the biases of I'm going to have fun, or like Tony Robbins' empowering rule, or I'm going to be zen about this, or I'm going to proactively determine that this is an experience that will be to my benefit, no matter what that frame is, going into it. And as a person who is skeptical and cynical by nature, it's hard to be willing to hand myself over to that process, even if I'm the person who designed it. Even if I'm the designer of the process, it's hard for me to hand myself over to it. I have a tendency to always be questioning it. But I think that there is wisdom in effectively pre-programming your own black box.
Yeah.
This is pre-programming your own GPS unit.
Yeah. And it's hard work. I mean, to program this is really hard work to find most things joyful. And you're going to slip and you're going to have those reactive and responsive moments. It's not always going to be proactive. Like, I can't say I'm in a state of this all the time. I have, emotional breakdowns or freakouts or, things I don't want to do or things that feel bad or times I can't seem to access this, right? But the striving is there. Mm-hmm. And I think the discipline of building the skill toward this is there. And I try to challenge myself, something I just absolutely hate doing, maybe something mundane even during the day. I'm trying to challenge myself, like, how can I use this to continue to build that skill of radically interpreting this as a joyful place to be?
I think the pushback, especially in the modern world, where I think modern day society puts a lot of value on struggle. Like we did a podcast about challenge versus struggle, and we always get some pushback from people who think that's a very privileged place to come from. But there's a pushback, I think, in society right now where struggle is good because we don't want to ignore problems. Like this idea that if you come at it sort of pre-programmed to believe that something is a good thing, then you're not going to see the problems and you're not going to do anything to solve them. And you might be in an okay position, but somebody else might not be benefiting from this. And so there's like this idea of being blissed out, right? And I don't think that's what you're talking about. I just want to create a distinction really quick. Because to me, the most empowering state or pre-frame in what you're talking about, and this is something I have done a lot of self-brainwashing around, is the idea that this is to my benefit. Like regardless of whether or not I'm going to feel happy about it or feel positive about it in the moment, regardless of whether or not it's going to make me feel all sorts of blissed out emotions, the one thing I have pre-wired myself to feel, no matter what the situation is this is to my benefit. Somehow this is to my benefit. I'm either going to learn a lesson here, or I'm going to have a good time, or I'm going to get nourished and resourced, or I'm going to have a bright light be shone in a dark place, or whatever the situation is. And that's not a blissed out place, right? Like you still get to feel the full experience. And you still get to feel all of the emotions and think all the thoughts that allow you to spot problems and challenges and diagnose them and feel things like empathy for somebody who's going through a tough time. And when you enter it with that frame, you're far less likely to leave feeling like a victim, like something like emotions of unhappiness or general dissatisfaction with life. And so I think that that's closer to what you're talking about.
Yeah, blissed out there's no skill to that. There's really not a lot of effort to be blissed out. I mean, you could just be on an opiate and be blissing yourself out, right? You could just take drugs or you could just try to ignore things. I'm not talking about that. I am talking about hard work and skill to create that state, that proactive state of joyful being. And I think that through that skill, it's not like all your other skills go away of identifying or seeing problems. It's that when you want to be in that proactive place, you have the skill built to access it. You have the ability to go there, right? You've built the discipline of understanding how you get yourself there in that proactive space. And again, I suspect that if we all build that for ourselves, we're going to want to be there as much as possible. And those problems you reference are easier to handle. Metaphorically, when we have our own oxygen mask on, we can actually attend to things and help other people put their oxygen masks on as well if we're able to be there ourselves. So yeah, I don't think blissed out is the place at all. I think it's actually a lot of hard work and discipline to be where I'm talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, and just to piggyback off what you just said, this idea that like the phrase "if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention" has always not rung true for me, because in my opinion, if you're paying attention and you actually think things need to be solved, outrage is one of the most resource hogging emotions that you can experience. It's going to take everything from you. And you can tell that outrage culture doesn't really get very far.
There's no skill there.
There's no skill, and it's so exhausting. Like outrage and upsetness and being triggered all the time, those are exhausting emotions. And you can't get very far because all of that emotional real estate, all that mental and emotional real estate could be going into problem solving. So to me, that's like, I feel like that's something that people self-soothe with. It's not an actual problem solving frame. That said, I think that when you're entering a situation, really, really trying to understand, how you can get something from this that's beneficial in the long term, and understanding that it's not happening to me, it's happening for me. I think that's a position that puts somebody in a very empowered state. And when you're in an empowered state, not only do you tend to be more centered and have that inner peace, you're calling it joyful expression, which I don't know if it always looks like joyful expression on the outside, but it's sort of a higher vibration place to be. I think that's so beneficial. Like if everybody was there, shit would get done, in my opinion. So I think that's a fantastic place to look. So that's the internal stuff. That's skill building and internal nodes in the system. What's some skill building and external nodes in the system? What are like some of the outer world things that a person needs to address and build skill around in order to have joyfulness, or we could even call it happiness, that sense of intrinsicness? What are the external skills that need to be built?
I think purpose, focusing on something that you're going toward, even if it's something small, is something in the outer world. I'm focused on this goal, and it could go higher abstract than that, like the purpose of my life or the mission of my life. But focusing on something that you're going toward cuts through a lot of distractions, because quite frankly, the responsive and reactive things that come to us, they distract us away from something where we're headed. It's easier to be proactive when you have something to be proactive toward. So setting up things that you're looking to do out there, like forward-thinking things, it's that magnet in the middle of the field that directs you toward that. And a lot of the BS that comes in your life, you just cut out now. You don't have to worry. It's like having blinders on because you're looking straight ahead at the thing you want to accomplish. And again, the argument can come, well, you're blinding yourself to all these real problems everywhere, and you got to be responsive to these. Well, why? Why do we all have to be responsive to all the problems? Like, we only have so much real estate. If we're constantly turning to the side all the time, no one's moving forward toward anything. But what if we each picked a goal? We all picked something we're heading toward, and we stay focused on that, and we don't get distracted. If enough people pick enough goals, things are going to get solved, right, in the world. And it's not going to help anybody to stop and constantly be turning left and right all the time in this reactive way or even a responsive way. It's that proactivity, I think, in the outer world that really helps.
Yeah, nonprofits don't choose every problem in the world. Nonprofits are like, we are trying to help children under the age of 10 that are dealing with malnourishment, or we want to focus on getting water to villages that don't have access to water and have to walk a mile to get it. It's like you pick one thing and you're far more likely to be able to address that one thing and solve it. Just like you mentioned, focus is so powerful for actually affecting change. There's another thing that you've been talking a lot about lately that I think it's going to seem ironic considering what we do. But you've been talking about this idea of acting, not articulating, because I think we're living in a world right now that does too much talking. And it tries to gain attention by doing a lot of talking. Now, this is, again, ironic considering that we're podcasters, but there's this sense of building something and the value of action, the value of going and doing something and taking action and focusing on building as opposed to trying to tear down with words. And I'm getting away from this idea of the power of articulation. And oh man, it was on Stratechery, which is a website that has really brilliant content and is impossible to say. Like every time I say his website name, I'm like, how could somebody so smart come up with a name that is impossible to say? Stratechery.com. One of the articles on there, the person said that in a world where people only talk, then words matter more. Like if talk is all you have and you never take action, suddenly policing talk is the most important thing you can do. And we're in a time period right now where policing talk is so much on the public consciousness that I sort of reverse engineered that thought to go, we're not taking enough action as people. We're doing way too much talking. And that makes sense because we're in a time period of social media explosion and a time period where we can do more talking than ever before. And people can feel more heard than ever before. And most people need to be heard. Like, I suspect if more people went to a therapist that just looked them in the eye and listened to them for 30 minutes, we'd probably have far fewer Twitter battles, because that's mostly what people need. They just need to be heard, and they need to know that they're an important enough person to have somebody listen to their expression. That's like a core need that humans have. And instead of just sitting down and being heard by somebody who's not looking at their phone, but just looking them in the eye and really listening to them, instead of doing that, we all go on social media and do flame wars, which is, I don't know, I guess is predictably irrationally human. That said, there's this idea of action creating, you make the comment, action creates its own authority.
I got it from Chuck Palahniuk's new book, Consider This, I think is what it's called, where he talks about this idea in writing.
Yeah, so take action. And I think just cutting, like you mentioned, cutting through the bullshit. It's like choose something that means something to you and build enough skill to make it happen. And feel free to aim high. I feel like you and I, or at least me, we've been synthetically keeping our goals small. And we don't want to do that anymore. Like you and I have both been getting very inspired by Walt Disney and Steve Jobs. Like Steve Jobs and Walt Disney just saw a future and wanted to make that future happen and took action and did a bunch of stuff that they had no idea what they were doing in order to build something that now impacts the entire planet. And you and I are like, why are we thinking so small? Let's just go do that. Let's see a future that we want to have a hand in influencing, and let's just go do whatever we can to build that thing, and let's just stop the bullshit talking. How about that? Now, of course, again, we're podcasters, so we're doing bullshit talking right now, but we're also trying to build something. We're trying to build something bigger for a future that we see as a possibility. And if we can influence the trajectory of that future, we might be able to get someplace that's kind of cool, or at least be a part of an ocean of people that are attempting to do that. So the way I'm interpreting what you say as the external skill to build is the skill development that naturally comes with having a big game goal, right? A mission, someplace you're going. And you have to build a lot of skills to get there. So having a magnet in the middle of the field is a node in the system of having joyfulness as an emergent.
I would agree. I mean, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. We were in Egypt recently, touring the pyramids and some of the temples there, and we didn't spend time reading any documents or looking over poetry. We were looking at the tangible structures that have been there for thousands and thousands of years, and we're looking at the meaning of them and what was left behind by people that built something. And I don't think we all have to go out and run and build, the next pyramid. But I think there is something to be said for building things that are tangible, because words are cheap. They're easy to say. They're easy to spell out. And having that mission for something in the outer world, something bigger that's tangible that you're creating, that may last a little longer than just some words you speak or even write down, that's a very interesting idea to me. And it's this trajectory of proactivity that we're talking about. You might be an author or a speaker or a podcaster. That's okay. We're not saying, obviously, come on, we write and do podcasting too, like Antonia just said. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. And also, we're all looking to do something tangible in the world, like an expression of something that's applied in the world, I think is really interesting as an idea. And even if it is something you write or speak, having something you're going toward cuts through a lot of the noise and gets you on that trajectory. And I think it is a avenue for getting to joyfulness. I look at, Elon Musk, let's say. He's out digging tunnels and building spaceships and cars. And yeah, he's in controversy half the time, but he's not out protesting at, government buildings and stuff. He's out like building real stuff. And he's caught up in some narratives and conversations that are happening, but he's actually creating things that people use and he's attempting to further things along humanity. And I think that's really interesting. And he probably doesn't get distracted. He probably finds himself in more joyful states often because he's got a purpose to his life. Even if you don't agree with that purpose, you could still look at him and say, yeah, he's still got a direction. He's got something that he's focused on. So he doesn't have all this distraction. He's not reacting and responding all the time. He's more proactive about what he wants to create and how he's moving through the world. And you could look at all sorts of different people doing this, right? Whoever that is, they have a direction they're going with. And I bet you those people have an access point to joyfulness more because they've set up their external system to create that platform for joyfulness.
I don't know if we can make too many statements about Elon Musk's sense of joyfulness. I mean, he had an affair with Amber Heard, so he can't be too happy.
Fair enough.
But that said...
I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying he is joyful. I'm saying I think that somebody like him, he's an example of maybe somebody that has more access to joyfulness.
I think that your point stands that when you are making an impact in the world, you have greater access to something that is sacred. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who make some of the biggest splash, they are not always the best examples of happiness or joyfulness. Like Steve Jobs arguably was an asshole. Can you be a joyful asshole? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. And a lot of these people die young, right? Because it's very stress-inducing to try to make a big game thing in the world. I have no idea where Elon Musk is at with joyfulness, but I think your point stands that when you have a mission, like you're part of something bigger. It actually makes me think of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where he says that we're 90% chimp and 10% bee, in the sense that most of our makeup is individualistic. Like we want to individualize and we want to be our own person and our own creature. And then there's like 10% of us that craves being part of something bigger than ourselves. And we usually find that in almost like a hive mentality when we de-individualize ourselves and become part of something bigger and become part of something that's more like a school of fish than it is any sort of like individualized, creature, a unique self. It's when we see ourselves as almost handing ourselves over to a whole, then we start to believe that we're part of something bigger. He calls it, he referred to somebody named Durkheim who talked about the difference between the sacred and the profane. And the profane is the mundane things that we do in life. And the sacred is anytime we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And we do that in all sorts of categories and all sorts of institutions. Religion obviously does that. Politics obviously does that. But we can just be part of like a football league, right? And that'll do it. As long as we're handing ourselves to something that's a bigger idea. And I think that when we become part of something bigger than ourselves, we enter a transcendent frame. And I think that that's something that we can do in the external world that helps create joyfulness as an emergent. Joyfulness, again, is not always, fun or smiles, but in a sense of intrinsicness, a sense that we're where we're supposed to be. And when we engage with the outer world in a way that diminishes the importance of our individual egos and merges with a greater thing outside of ourselves, that's when we enter a space of sacredness. And I think that's a node in the system. I think that's a node in the system of joyfulness and intrinsicness being the emergent. And that usually happens with a mission. It happens with something that we're trying to accomplish that's bigger than just ourselves. I think one of the reasons why joyfulness can feel elusive or even sustainable happiness can feel elusive is that there are a lot of I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, which I think is really important. And that is there's skill necessary to being a joyful person. And as children, we believe that it happens to us with outside forces, right? We are at the mercy of the things that happen to us. And when we get older, we realize that we have to throw in more sense of agency in there. We have to go, okay, well, maybe it's me. I'm the person who creates my joyful experience. And then I think as we get a little bit further along, we go, well, it's actually a combination of the outside world and the inner world, with the control falling on me and how I'm going to respond to the outside world. And then we get a little further along in the maturity of that. And then we say, I can actually precede how I want to experience the world. So I'm going to do the inner work, the skill development that happens inside of me to become the kind of person who shows up consistently the way that I want to show up in the world every time. And then we go a little further down the road and we go, and a part of that is having a mission. A part of that is not just the inner work that I do, the inner game work I do, but a part of that is showing up and having something that I'm heading toward, taking action in the world, and then having to build all the outer world skills to support and facilitate the mission that I ultimately want to accomplish. And that seems to be this sort of multi-layered, multi-level operating thing that requires a little bit of peacemaking on our side, a little bit of acceptance of the outside world, a little bit of presence of what's happening, a little bit of internal discipline, right? A little bit of disciplining ourselves and being patient and pausing and not allowing ourselves to be triggered and reacting. And a little bit of skill development in the outside world, recognizing that overcoming and becoming a better version of ourselves and becoming more competent and capable, all of these things pour into the system that allows happiness, or not happiness, but joyfulness and intrinsicness to be the emergent.
I think the radical view that I have is that I believe, after we talked about all this, I have a belief. I can't prove this to you, but I think that most people enter the world with a proactive view of how they're going to experience reality. I believe that everyone comes pre-wiring their experiences, and we get out what we assume we're going to get out, even if it's unconscious. So there's a sense of what I experience happened to me in that responsiveness, what happened, out there or inside of myself, that was something that emerged. And I have this probably unpopular belief that we actually already decided what we're going to feel before we felt it. Even unconsciously, we decided that. Or we didn't do the work to feel something different, so we go back to a default that we felt before. And I think that's how most people experience the world. And so when we talk about, going all the way back to what we talked about before, this idea of skill is taking full control of that process and building skill and writing onto what we want to experience. Radical subjectivity as we move through the world. The perceptions we take in what's going for us, what we take into our eyes, our nose, our ears, what we smell, taste, touch, all of these things can be radically subjective to how we want to experience them. Mm-hmm. And, some of my experience with psychedelics and meditation and just experience of life show me that these things are not static. They're not objectively true how I experience reality. I can subjectively attune myself to that. Our reticular activation system attunes to certain things in life. And I think we're doing this unconsciously all the time. So the message I have for all of us as we talk about all these things, all these systems and everything is, if we realize we're doing that anyway, why don't we choose to do the thing that's going to lead us toward joyfulness? And again, I don't know if everybody's going to agree with me on this, but that's how I see reality at this point.
The only caveats that I have to what you just said are people who would not be listening to this podcast. Anybody who has the capacity to tune into a podcast and has the technology and the world conditions to be listening to this, I think follows that rule. I do think that there are people who are born into extraordinary poverty or extraordinary trauma that are at the mercy of the world wiring them a certain way from a very young age. You know, it's like the easiest way to be brainwashed is to be born. And the world can brainwash you to horrific events that pre-wire you to experience it in a certain way, and you don't get a lot of choice, especially if you have a very short lifespan.
I can understand that. To basically what you're saying is, like, the unconsciousness, maybe somebody didn't choose. Like, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that you're choosing to experience everything you're experiencing.
Right, exactly.
Consciously.
No, yeah.
It could be programmed on you.
Yeah, I mean, like,
I agree with that.
Like a little kid who's like, running the streets of Somalia, a little orphan kid who's like stealing bread and getting beaten, in Somalia that's not who we're talking about, right? Like, that kid is not.
Well, I would say he does enter the world expecting to have it give him a certain experience.
But
whether he chose that or not is a different story.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree that that person has also been wired to experience the world in a certain way. And because the burden of survival is so oppressive, there's not any space to reflect back on whether or not that's how that person wants to be experiencing it.
Totally understand that.
Like being able to look at the programming in your GPS unit or in the black box, so to speak, is something that you have to have like a certain Maslow level in order to be able to even reflect. And if a person has internet connection and a device to be able to listen to things on the internet and the time and space to be able to listen to a podcast, I think that rule applies. So anybody who's listening to this, I would totally agree with you. Which
rule? The rule that we enter the world projecting the reality we see back, or the rule that we can do something about it?
The rule we can do something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the first rule is just a rule. It just is. It's not a judgment. It's not a value judgment on people.
I agree.
Yeah, it's like that's just how it works, right? We're just, it's like we're brainwashed into certain language. We're brainwashed into certain pre-wiring. We're brainwashed into the cultures that we're raised in. We're brainwashed into the family values. Like, all of that is wiring that we did not choose. But then there's this moment when we go, I can actually do something about that. And anybody with an internet connection and the capacity to learn things on the internet is now officially in a position of personal responsibility for looking at the programming of their mind and determining how they want to reprogram themselves. They are at least well, I think everybody's responsible for it, but they have the opportunity to do it. And not everybody on the planet has that opportunity, but anybody who can listen to this does. So as far as the rule goes, it might as well just be it's like, don't, anybody who's exception thinking, like, you're thinking about somebody who we're not talking about. You know what I mean? And on top of that, I think that that's the most empowering way of looking at things, even if it's not true. Even if it's not true, it's an empowering rule. The disempowering rule is I can't do anything about this. That's the disempowering rule. So looking at joyfulness and intrinsicness and inner peace and whatever it is we're talking about here as the emergent of a system that has nodes in it that can be influenced by us as individuals is the most empowering position to take. And all of that said, this podcast went totally different than I thought it was going to when we first started.
Yeah.
Like, I thought we were just going to talk about a couple things around happiness, and yet we went, I hope we weren't too abstract. I think what we should do is we should title this something fairly abstract to give people fair warning of where we're headed. Because this is not a usual one, I don't think.
This is the kind of stuff, though, that I think about a lot, and I think this is cool to bring out, because I'm sure you listening think about these kind of things, too. And it's interesting probably to eavesdrop on a conversation about stuff that goes on in your head. When we started this podcast way back, we called it intuitive pornography, right? This idea of kind of listening into intuitive conversations and the idea of thinking about abstract terms and concepts and unpacking them and questioning them and finding the through line between things. And so this is maybe one of those kind of conversations, and I think that's okay. I think you probably have some resonance to the things we're talking about, maybe some pushback, maybe some experiences you'd like to share, and we'd love to hear from you, actually. If you come over to personalityhacker.com, You can leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story or experience directly below this podcast. Tell us what's coming up for you. What are you experiencing as you listen in as a third party to this conversation? You haven't had a microphone, but now's your chance to come and make your voice heard.
And if this was not too abstract a conversation, we didn't totally lose you, and you enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you want to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We also have a book that's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at major retailers online like Amazon, Books A Million, etc., etc. And if you buy it and enjoy it, please leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads. That also helps us out a lot. We also have a catalog of really great personal development programs that are designed to use your personality type as a leverage point to becoming the best version of yourself and making better decisions. So if that's interesting to you, head over to personalityhacker.com and look at our product catalog to see if one of those programs is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.